Have you ever believed that your soulmate might be a creature from legend? At the edge of the Quinault Rainforest, near the quiet town of Forks, Washington, lived a 76-year-old widow named Evelyn Marsh. She spent over 5 decades in silence, grieving her husband and the little sister who vanished in those very woods. Then, one late summer afternoon, Evelyn heard someone muttering among the trees. Curious, she followed the voice and found a massive, brown-furred creature sitting on a log, grumbling about back pain. When she whispered, "Hello," he looked up and replied, like a grumpy old man. His name was Thatcher, and the next day, he came back for tea. But what no one expected was this. Evelyn and Thatcher shared the same haunting memory. Years ago, Thatcher heard 2 children crying in the woods, but his Bigfoot clan forbade him from helping humans. He hesitated, and the younger child vanished. That girl was Evelyn's sister. 2 souls, one human, one beast, bound by the same grief, by a moment of silence that echoed through time. This story comes from Evelyn's final journal entries, where she wrote about a creature who didn't just speak, but listened better than any human ever had. And in the next few minutes, you'll learn why a Bigfoot saved the man who tried to shoot him, how a broken family healed over one unforgettable dinner and the farewell that made a whole town cry. The story is now passed down by Evelyn's granddaughter, Lucy, the little girl who once asked, "Mr. Bigfoot, how do you brush your teeth?" Now she tells it, so you can feel a bit of that warmth too. And hey, where are you watching this from? What's your name, dear friend? How far can this story travel? How many hearts can it touch? Leave a comment to let us know. And if this tale made you smile, consider liking the video and subscribing to join our little forest-loving corner of the internet. Together, let's build a community that still believes in kindness, stories, and maybe Bigfoot. It had rained for 3 days straight. Not the kind of storm that rattled your roof and screamed through the pines, but that persistent, whispering drizzle that settled into your bones, made everything smell like wet bark and old sorrow. Evelyn Marsh stepped off the moss-covered porch of her cabin with an old woven shawl around her shoulders and a thermos of lukewarm tea gripped in both hands. Her boots squished into the spongy trail like they had every afternoon for the past 20 years. Same steps. Same fog hanging just above the fern line. Same ache in her right knee whenever the temperature dropped below 50. She didn't walk for exercise. Didn't walk to feel young again. She walked because the forest was the only place that didn't make her feel like a leftover. Out here, the trees didn't pity her. They didn't ask about her son. They didn't whisper about how she used to be the head librarian in town, back when the Forks Library was still lit by oil lamps and carried more nature journals than paperbacks. She paused at the bend where the cedar split into 2, where one root curved out like a crooked finger. That spot always made her chest pull tight. She never let herself think about why. The fog thickened just ahead, silver blue and soft, like breathing through cotton. It was colder today. Not winter cold, but cold enough that the thermos steamed when she unscrewed the cap. That's when she heard it. A voice, low, raspy, muttering like someone grumbling into their own collar. She froze. For a split second, her brain offered up the possibility of hikers. But no one hiked this deep in Quinault anymore, not without a compass and a death wish. And even if they did, who would be talking to themselves like that? Kai kus go nai kung jen muk lung toi sap gay, it said. Her breath caught. She knew that voice wasn't human. Or rather, it was trying to sound human, but there was something off. The vowels dragged. The tone had the weight of something unused to using language aloud. Her feet, traitorous, carried her forward anyway. Slow, one careful step at a time, like crossing a frozen lake you weren't sure would hold. The forest opened slightly. A natural clearing. Dim, but wide enough for the light to slant in from above. Diluted through layers of cloud, rain, and old pine needles. And there he was, not crouched, not hiding, sitting, like a weary old man on a boulder too small for his frame, with one massive hand rubbing the small of his back and the other steadying himself against a mossy log. He was big, but not monstrous. 7, maybe 8 feet, built like an oak trunk in motion. His fur was a rich rain-dark brown, tangled in places, but not unkempt. There was a kind of quiet order to him, like something carved from ancient time and forced to live in a century of asphalt and antennas. He hadn't noticed her yet. Or maybe he had. She took a breath, but her voice wouldn't come. Then he chuckled. A dry, gravel-soft chuckle that echoed too deep for the space. "I've told them for years. These logs are murder on the lower lumbar." He spoke like he was continuing a conversation, like someone had been listening all along. Evelyn clutched the thermos tighter. The forest was too still. He turned then, slowly, and when his eyes met hers, she almost dropped the tea, not because they were glowing or monstrous, but because they were familiar. The way a grandfather looks at you when you bring him a photo he hasn't seen in 60 years. "Evelyn," he said gently, as if her name was something sacred. Her knees threatened to buckle. She hadn't told anyone her full name in years. The kids in town called her Mrs. Marsh. Her mail came addressed to E. Marsh. But this thing, this creature, spoke it like a memory. Her throat cracked. "How do you know my name?" He smiled, almost sheepishly, then shifted on the log with an exaggerated wince. "I remember voices better than faces. And yours was always full of questions." He tapped the side of his head. "You used to ask about cloud shapes. Remember?" She stepped back. "What?" His smile faded just enough. He looked down at the wet earth. "There was a girl," he said, almost too softly. "A little one. Got lost in this forest a long time ago. I remember her calling, 'Evie, Evie.'" She stopped breathing. "No one called her that. Not since—" No, it wasn't possible. He looked up again. "She was brave, scared, but brave. You went for help. I watched you run. I've thought about that moment for a long, long time." Evelyn felt the edges of the world tilt. Her chest ached in that way it hadn't since her sister disappeared. A wound stitched shut, but never truly healed. "Who are you?" she whispered. He stood, slowly, groaning as if his joints bore centuries. Rain clung to his fur like dew on heavy branches. He looked even taller up close, but his presence wasn't threatening. It was familiar, like an old neighbor who just happened to be 8 feet tall and covered in hair. "They call me Thatcher," he said with a nod. "You can too." She stared. "Thatcher?" He looked pleased. "Figured I needed something more dignified than beast or thing in the trees. Don't you think?" Something in her cracked. He dusted his palms. "Anyway, you make tea, right?" She blinked. "Your cabin. Still the one with the yellow curtains and the creaky back door?" She nodded before she could stop herself. "Good. I'll drop by tomorrow," he said, already turning. "Maybe you can put something soft on that bench. My back's not what it used to be." Then, with a parting wave and a surprisingly graceful pivot, he disappeared into the mist, the trees swallowing him whole as if he'd never been there. Evelyn stood frozen. The rain picked up slightly, whispering against her shoulders. Somewhere in the distance, a bird cawed once, then went silent. The forest was the same, and completely changed. She didn't know how long she stood there, but when she finally turned back toward home, the fog seemed lighter, the shadows less accusing. She couldn't name the feeling blooming in her chest, but it was warm, unsettlingly so, like a memory pressing its cheek against hers after decades apart. When she reached the porch, she paused, looked back at the trees. What if he really showed up tomorrow? What in God's name was she supposed to do if he actually knocked? Or worse, what if he didn't? And the forest stayed quiet forever. The wind shifted. Somewhere in the woods, a branch creaked. Not a threat, not a warning. Just the sound of something very old, adjusting to make space. Evelyn exhaled. Then, without a word, she stepped inside. The door shut softly behind her, But the quiet wasn't the same as before. It felt expectant now. She placed the thermos on the table, her hand still trembling just a little. Tomorrow, she'd make tea in the big pot, the one she hadn't used since Harold passed. And maybe, just maybe, she'd dig out the old seat cushion from the attic, the one with the faded floral pattern. She wasn't sure if it would make a difference to a creature like Thatcher, but it mattered to her. It meant someone was welcome. And tonight, for the first time in a long while, Evelyn didn't feel completely alone. Not because the forest had changed, but because it had remembered her name and whispered it back, just loud enough to be real. Evelyn had barely slept. The fire in the stove had long turned to ash. Shadows clung to the corners of the cabin, unmoved by the flickering lamp she left on overnight. She sat in her chair by the window, wrapped in the same woven shawl, her knees stiff from stillness, her eyes fixed on the tree line where the fog clung to every branch like secrets that didn't want to be remembered. It was a quiet kind of dread, not the screaming kind, just a low hum in the gut, the way you feel before a letter arrives you didn't want sent. He said he'd come, said he wanted tea, like he was just a neighbor, a man with sore joints and a stubborn memory. Except he wasn't a man, was he? The kettle had already boiled once. She'd let it cool, boiled it again. Still no sound outside. Her breath fogged up the glass as she leaned closer, squinting through the early drizzle. Maybe she'd dreamed it. People do strange things when they're alone too long. But just as that thought formed, there it was. A knock. No, not a knock. It was a deep, thudding pound that rattled the ceramic mug on the table. Like someone had taken a log to the back door, not out of anger, but because it was the only tool their hand-shaped body had ever known. She stood, slower than usual, her hand brushing the windowsill as she walked toward the kitchen. The rain had picked up. Drips traced down the small square window in the door, distorting the silhouette standing behind it. She hesitated. Then, with a hand that remembered how to open this exact lock 1,000 times, she turned the handle and pulled. He had to duck, hard, to get through the frame. The entire cabin groaned as he tried. His shoulder caught on the upper trim, knocking a dusting of wood chips onto the floor. The door frame creaked like a violin string about to snap. He muttered something that sounded like ridiculous architecture as he squeezed inside sideways, twisting his shoulders like someone too big for a coat they refused to admit no longer fit. Once inside, he took up the entire corner of the room, almost wall to wall. His fur was damp, dripping gently onto the braided rug Evelyn had crocheted in '79. He sniffed once, deeply, and blinked at the warmth, then smiled. "It smells like cinnamon," he said, surprised. Evelyn was too focused on not passing out to respond. She gestured stiffly to the chair across the table, the big one Harold had always used. Thatcher eyed it, raised one brow ridge. "Unless this is made of redwood and reinforced steel, I should probably sit on the floor." She nodded. He lowered himself down with an exaggerated groan, stretching out one leg, then the other, before settling cross-legged, nearly eye level with the tabletop. His fur left a damp outline on the wood behind him. "Tea," she offered, her voice a thread. "Please," he said, eyes brightening. She reached for the biggest pot she had, the one she used when Lucy was small and obsessed with making pretend stews out of rainwater and pine needles. It wasn't a teapot by any stretch, but it could hold enough for him. She poured the water, hands trembling slightly, then busied herself with the motions, bags, mugs, sugar. It kept her from staring. He watched her, head tilted, as if cataloging every detail for safekeeping. She couldn't explain why, but it made her feel seen, in a way she hadn't in years. When she set the mug in front of him, he took it with both hands, sniffed, then sipped, careful and slow. "Hot," he winced, but in a good way. They sat like that for a while. The clock ticked behind her, the one her sister gave her the year before she vanished. Rain tapped on the roof, slow and steady. The stove creaked with each flicker of flame. Finally he spoke. Do you know squirrels lie? She blinked. What? Squirrels, he nodded. Always pretending to bury food, then darting off the other way. Tricky little devils. They think I don't see it, but I've lived long enough to spot a decoy stash when I see one. She stared. He sipped again. And the moon, he added. Strange thing, the moon. Always there, but not always watching. Some nights she turns her face away. Makes you wonder what she doesn't want to see. There was something almost childlike in the way he said it. Philosophical, but not showy. More like someone who'd had too much time to think and too few people to listen. Do you live nearby? She asked carefully. He nodded. Not far, close enough to hear things. Sometimes words, sometimes silence. That's louder, you know. She wasn't sure she did, but the way he said it made her believe him. He looked toward the bookshelf near the wall. Not at the books themselves, but at the empty space beside them. Used to sit outside the schoolhouse long ago. Couldn't get close. The others, my kind, they forbade it. Said it was dangerous to learn things not meant for us. But I listened anyway. To spelling lessons, stories. Got better at it the more I listened. She swallowed. He turned back to her. I know your name because I heard it 100 times. Heard the others calling you. Heard the girl. The one who got lost. Something in her eyes shifted. She didn't speak. I remember her voice, he said gently. High-pitched, frightened, but trusting. She believed you'd come back. Evelyn's hands tightened on her mug. She looked down at the steam curling into the dim air. I left her, she whispered. I ran. She told you to, he replied instantly. She said go get someone. She didn't want you to be alone in the woods either. It took a long time for her to lift her eyes again. Why are you telling me this? Because, he said slowly, sometimes what haunts us isn't what happened. It's what we never let ourselves hear. The words landed like soft stones in her chest. She didn't speak, not right away. Just sat with them. Let them settle. Let them hurt, the way truth always does when it fits too well. After a while, he stood. As carefully as he had come down, his joints popped. He winced, then offered a wry look toward the cushion she'd placed on the bench beside the door. Appreciate the thought, he said. But next time, maybe 2 cushions. She snorted despite herself. The sound surprised both of them. He stepped toward the door, careful not to knock over the coat rack. At the threshold, he paused. This house, he said without turning. It's been watched. A long time. Her stomach clenched. Watched? He nodded. We don't just vanish, you know. We watch. We remember. Especially the ones who listen back. Then he was gone, slipping through the doorway like a shadow finding its home. The rain greeted him with gentle applause. Evelyn stood in the quiet that followed, mug warm in her hands. Tears balanced along her lower lids like raindrops refusing to fall. 50 years. 50 years of silence, of guilt, of loneliness. And in one morning, a creature older than any story she'd ever heard told her something no one else ever had. It's not your fault. The words lingered in the cabin like incense, sweet and sharp. Impossible to forget. She didn't wipe her face, just stood there tasting salt and tea and memory. Then the phone rang. She flinched, picked it up. Daniel's voice came through, cheerful and oblivious. Hey, Mom, Lucy and I are coming up next week. Maybe sooner. Thought it'd be nice to spend a little time at the cabin before the cold really sets in. That okay? Her stomach dropped. She hesitated too long. Mom? Yes, she said quickly, too quickly. Of course. I'd love that. She hung up and stared at the door, at the cushion, at the trail of damp footprints still drying on the floor. She'd need to come up with a plan, soon. Because hiding a creature like Thatcher wasn't going to be as easy as boiling a pot of tea. The forest looked different when children returned to it. Not louder, not messier, just sharper. Like the trees held their breath a little longer, unsure whether to lean in or pull away. The red station wagon crunched its way up the gravel path, tires spitting little pebbles into the underbrush. Evelyn stood on the porch with her arms crossed, one boot tapping lightly against the wood, not in impatience, but in something close to dread. She had done this welcome so many times before. Each holiday, each visit, always the same script. But this time, something sat heavy beneath her ribs. Something she hadn't prepared for. The engine cut off. The doors opened. Daniel climbed out first, all 6 foot something of him, hair thinning at the temples, still wearing that coat he swore wasn't too big. Lucy followed with a slam of the passenger door, hoodie half-zipped, eyes already darting toward the treetops like they were part of the mystery she hadn't yet solved. "Grandma!" she called, lifting one hand. Evelyn smiled, tried to anchor herself in that sound. By the time they reached the porch, Lucy was already asking if there'd be pie. Evelyn nodded, hugged her once, short and tight, before turning to Daniel with a nod that said everything their words didn't. "You sure it's not too cold up here?" he asked, rubbing his hands. "I've lived through worse," she replied, and that was that. The first few hours passed like muscle memory. Suitcases thudded onto the old guest bed. Lucy found her way to the kitchen and pulled open the tin labeled cinnamon real, as if nothing had changed since she was 10. Evelyn let her, hands steadying the teacups in the sink even though she wasn't really washing them. She hadn't told them. Not yet. "What do you say? There's a large, hairy friend who drinks tea and knows things he shouldn't." She'd planned to say something, but then Lucy laughed at something Daniel said, and Evelyn didn't want to ruin that sound. That evening, while Daniel was unpacking and Evelyn was half listening to the local forecast on the radio, Lucy pressed her forehead against the cold kitchen window and squinted. "There's something on the porch," she said. Evelyn froze. "What?" "I think—" Lucy leaned closer. "Yeah, something big. I saw a hand." Evelyn's chest tightened. "You're imagining things," but Lucy was already unlocking the back door. Evelyn couldn't move fast enough to stop her. The porch was empty, just wet boards and the smell of wood smoke. Lucy frowned. "It was here, I swear. Something was sniffing the pie tin." Evelyn exhaled slowly. "You probably saw a raccoon. With a hand that big?" She didn't answer. Later that night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Evelyn stood at the stove, stirring honey into a steaming mug. The back door creaked, just a little. She didn't look. "You shouldn't come when others are here," she whispered. "I knocked," came the low voice. No answer, figured the pie was a signal. She turned then. He was crouched by the far end of the porch, barely lit by the kitchen's warm glow, his massive shoulders hunched beneath the overhang, raindrops glistening along the fur of his arms. "You left a whole pie," he said. "Do you know what kind of restraint it took not to eat the tin?" Evelyn sighed, stepped outside with the mug, and handed it to him. "I suppose the squirrels taught you manners," she muttered. "They tried," he said. "Failed." He sipped, and the porch creaked softly under his weight. "You're not alone," he said, eyes drifting toward the guest window. "My son and my granddaughter. She's the one with the fast eyes. She's 14, thinks she's 20. She'll see me," he said, almost amused. "Eventually." Evelyn said nothing. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the smell of pine and damp wood. "She already did," came a voice from behind the screen door. They both turned. Lucy stood there barefoot, her sweatshirt sleeves pulled over her hands, wide-eyed, but not screaming. "Who are you?" she asked. There was no fear, just the curiosity of someone raised on too many books and not enough boundaries. Thatcher blinked. "I'm a guest, like Bigfoot guest." He looked to Evelyn. She gave the smallest nod. Thatcher cleared his throat. "I prefer Thatcher, but yes." Lucy stepped forward, slowly, her eyes scanning every inch of him like she was cataloging details for later. "You smell like old moss and burnt wood." He grinned. "And you smell like cinnamon and questions." She sat down cross-legged on the top step without asking. Evelyn didn't stop her. Thatcher shifted slightly, trying to look smaller. "Do you live here?" Lucy asked. "Nearby." "For how long?" "A while." "What's a while?" He paused. "Since before TV was warm-colored." She laughed, a real laugh. Evelyn leaned against the doorway, mug warm in her hands, wondering how this girl could be so at ease. Thatcher tapped a claw gently against the porch rail. "Why aren't you scared?" Lucy shrugged. "You don't feel scary." Thatcher tilted his head. "That's a dangerous assumption." "But true." They talked like that for a while, about weather, squirrels, why stars look different when you're lying flat on your back. Evelyn watched them, a strange ache blooming in her chest. Not jealousy, not fear. Something else. A longing for something she thought she'd lost forever. The next morning, Daniel nearly stepped on a muddy footprint the size of a hubcap near the back door. He frowned, then glanced toward the woods. "Bear?" he asked. "Probably," Evelyn lied, too quickly. He didn't look convinced. Later that day, Lucy found an old Polaroid in a shoebox. Her Uncle Frank in a cheap gorilla suit from a long-ago Halloween. She laughed and held it up. "Remember this? He scared the crap out of me when I was 6. Evelyn smiled tightly. "I remember." Lucy stared at the picture a second longer than necessary, then tucked it into her journal without a word. That evening, the porch was quiet. Evelyn stood out there alone, arms folded against the chill, and thought of something she hadn't said aloud in years. "If someone like you had been with my sister that day," she whispered to the trees, "maybe she'd still be here." There was no answer, just the sound of wind threading through the pine needles. Inside, Lucy sat by the fire, sketching something in her notebook. Daniel scrolled through the weather updates on his phone, the only glowing screen in a room full of shadows and soft heat. Outside, Thatcher moved through the woods, silent as memory, leaving no sign but the warmth that lingered long after he was gone. By morning, word had already started to spread. Someone in town claimed they saw a large shadow dart across the edge of the Marsh property. Others swore they heard heavy breathing outside their camper. One boy posted on a message board, "Bigfoot's real, I swear, right by my grandma's house." And Buck Halpern, who'd spent too many years with too many failed hunts, tapped the end of his rifle, narrowed his eyes toward the hills, and whispered, "Not this time." In the cabin, Evelyn set the kettle on the stove and tried to ignore the buzzing tension in her bones. Whatever quiet they'd known was unraveling, and the forest wasn't the only one listening anymore. It had rained the night before, but not enough to wash away the scent. By dawn, the yard behind Evelyn's cabin was littered with yellowed pine needles and scattered leaves, some torn clean by the wind, others damp and stuck to the porch steps. The ground squelched underfoot, soft and uneasy, like the earth itself hadn't slept well. Daniel was the first to notice the shell casing. He bent down, just outside the woodshed, and plucked the brass cylinder from the mud. Still shiny, fresh. He turned it over in his fingers. "This isn't yours, right, Mom?" Evelyn stood in the doorway, hands wiping against a dish towel that didn't need drying. She stared at it, her voice quiet but heavy. "No. I don't own a shotgun." Daniel's brow pinched. "You sure it wasn't just a hunter passing through? There haven't been hunters up this trail in decades." He looked out toward the tree line. "Not unless someone invited them." But Evelyn didn't answer. Her eyes had drifted beyond him, locked on something half hidden in the grass. A boot print. Larger than hers, narrower than Daniel's. Deep. Someone had walked close. Too close. Lucy was still in the cabin, flipping through a book on mosses she'd found in the attic. One leg swinging off the edge of the couch, her face angled toward the light like a sunflower. She hadn't heard what they found. She hadn't seen what was coming. It started later that afternoon, when Buck Halpern pulled up in his old blue truck, the one with the deer rack on top and a red flannel shirt folded over the passenger seat like a forgotten flag. He didn't knock, just leaned an elbow on the porch rail, spat a glob of tobacco into the gravel, and cleared his throat loud enough to rattle the window. Evelyn stepped out first. Buck grinned. "You know, I thought I was just seeing things the other night, but then the boys down at the store said they saw it too." "Saw what?" He lifted one thick brow. "You tell me." Daniel appeared behind her, face tightening. Buck chuckled. "Saw something bigger than a bear. Broad shoulders, fast on 2 legs. Out there in the trees. You always did keep strange company, Evelyn. This is private land, and I respect that. Buck said, pushing off the rail. "But if you got something dangerous sniffing around, well, folks got a right to know, got a right to defend themselves." "From what?" Buck tilted his head. "Whatever the hell it is you're hiding." That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. Neither could Lucy. She heard the floor creak just past midnight, padded softly out of bed, and found her grandmother already at the window, a blanket around her shoulders, mug cold in her hands. "Is it him?" Lucy whispered. Evelyn didn't look away. "No." "Then who?" Evelyn just said. "Someone who doesn't understand what mercy looks like." The next morning, Buck was back in the woods. Not alone this time. A few others followed him. 2 younger guys with long coats and camera gear. Half hunters, half thrill seekers. One carried a rifle, the other a camcorder with duct tape wrapped around the grip. They weren't subtle. Their boots snapped twigs. Their voices carried. Daniel paced the porch, jaw tight. "We should call the sheriff." Evelyn shook her head. "The sheriff plays poker with Buck twice a week. You think he'll care?" Lucy watched the woods, her breath fogging the glass. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "This is insane. Are we seriously just letting some armed lunatic stalk through your backyard?" "He's not looking for a bear," Evelyn said. Daniel blinked. "Are you saying he's looking for him?" She said nothing. Daniel exhaled hard. "Jesus, Mom! How long have you known?" "Long enough." He stepped back, his hand gripping the windowsill. "You've completely lost it." Lucy turned toward him. "You saw the footprint. You saw the claw marks near the shed. That doesn't mean—" "It does," Evelyn said, her voice flat. "And if Buck finds him first, it won't end with questions." Daniel looked like he wanted to argue, but his hands stayed at his sides. The gunshot cracked through the trees like a whip. Evelyn's heart stuttered. Lucy gasped. Then came the second sound. Wood splintering, leaves scattering, a deep rumble like something old giving way. She ran before anyone could stop her. Down the porch steps, into the clearing, through the rain-slicked brush. Her boots sank into mud, her breath ragged. Daniel shouted behind her. Lucy followed too, stumbling once but never stopping. They found Buck in a ravine, pinned beneath a tree. A rotten one, long dead but still massive, its trunk now split across the slope like a fallen pillar. The younger men stood frozen nearby, one with the rifle dropped, the other shaking as he held the camcorder like a shield. Thatcher was already there. He stood just feet from Buck, massive, rain-soaked, his fur streaked with bark and mud. His eyes locked on Evelyn first, then Lucy, then Daniel as they arrived, one by one, breathless and stunned. Buck groaned, trapped beneath the trunk. His leg twisted, blood seeping into the moss. I didn't mean to," he stammered. Thatcher took a step forward. Evelyn raised a hand. "Don't." But he wasn't attacking. He knelt. The movement was slow, almost reverent. He placed one hand on the trunk, lifted it. Just enough. The younger men flinched. Buck's breath caught. Then Thatcher pulled, using the roots as leverage, and rolled the log off the injured man in one impossible fluid motion. Then he stood, looked at Buck, looked past him. "I don't like guns," he said quietly. Buck stared, pale, lips moving but no words coming. Daniel couldn't look away. Not anymore. Later, after the men had gone, after Buck was driven off to the clinic swearing he wouldn't say a word, they sat by the fire. The room smelled like wet fur and pine needles. Evelyn cleaned the scratches on Thatcher's shoulder with trembling hands. "You didn't have to help him," she whispered. "I didn't do it for him." She stopped, looked up. "I saw his eyes," Thatcher said. "The way he looked at the end, like someone begging not to die. I've seen that look before." Evelyn dabbed at a bruise on his arm. "When?" "Years ago. On a child who called out to someone who never came back." Her hand paused. He closed his eyes. "It's not the sound that stays. It's the silence after." Daniel stood in the corner, arms folded, face unreadable. Lucy curled up on the couch, watching them. Watching him. "I believe you now," Daniel said finally. All of it. Evelyn didn't smile. She was too tired. But something inside her settled. As Thatcher stood to leave, Lucy reached out and touched his hand. Just briefly. Just enough. He looked down, surprised. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, then disappeared into the night. Quiet as ever. The rain had stopped, but the wind had changed. The rain had lifted, but the sky remained dim, like someone had drawn a thin sheet of parchment over the sun. The forest had taken on that hushed orange tone that only came in mid-autumn, when every step stirred a whisper from the leaves, and even the wind moved more carefully through the branches. Evelyn sat on the porch alone, a thick wool blanket around her shoulders, and her eyes tracing the same tree line she'd known since she was 8. The coffee in her cup had long gone cold. The air smelled like wood rot and cedar oil. That was the strange thing about October. It never let you forget the things you thought were buried. She'd barely heard him approach, not because he was silent, but because her thoughts had filled the silence first. It wasn't until the boards creaked under that familiar weight that she looked up. Thatcher stood just beyond the railing, half shadowed in the overcast light. His posture was wrong. Not tense, not defensive, just quiet. And for him, that said more than it should have. "You're late," she said gently. He nodded once. "Sorry, I didn't want to come." That stopped her cold. She set the cup down, then moved aside on the bench, an invitation without words. He didn't sit, just rested his hand on the railing, fingers twitching like they were trying to shape thoughts he couldn't speak. Evelyn waited. He said nothing. The silence stretched. Finally, she broke it. "You've never come here without talking. I know." "What happened?" He blinked slowly. Then finally, he sat. The bench groaned under him, but he didn't adjust like he usually did, just stared out at the trees. "I've been thinking about the girl," he said. "The little one. Your sister." Evelyn's chest tensed, but she didn't interrupt. "I used to pretend it didn't matter, that if I never talked about it, maybe the memory would stop following me." His voice was lower than usual, stripped of that sardonic warmth he liked to hide behind. "But it's always there. Every time the forest goes quiet, I hear it again." He reached into the satchel slung across his back and pulled out something she didn't expect, a small folded square of cloth, old, weathered, faded pink with fraying corners. "She dropped it," he whispered. "The day it happened." Evelyn reached out without thinking, fingers brushing the fabric. The pattern was still visible, tiny violets stitched into one corner. Her mother had made it. A handkerchief too big for a girl that small. "How long have you had this?" she asked, her voice raw. "Since then." She looked at him. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to know I was there," he said. "That I watched and didn't help." Her throat tightened. "I wasn't much older than she was," he went on. "Still learning the ways of the clan, still obeying rules I didn't understand. We weren't allowed to interfere. We watched. We remembered. That was the law." He exhaled, long and bitter. "She was crying. You ran off. I heard her call out once. Then, nothing. When I went back, she was gone." Evelyn closed her eyes. "I should have stayed," she whispered. "I should have pulled her with me." "You were a child." "So were you." Thatcher turned his face away. His jaw flexed, eyes tight. "I talk too much," he muttered. "I always have. But the silence, it's worse. When it gets quiet, all I hear is that moment. All I feel is that decision." She looked down at the handkerchief in her lap. "We both carry it." He glanced at her. "Guilt?" "No, the moment, frozen in our bodies, like it imprinted itself in our bones." They sat there for a long while. No birds called, no wind moved the branches. It was the kind of stillness that didn't just settle. It listened. Finally, Evelyn lifted her gaze. "What happened to the clan after that?" "They moved further north, closer to where the rules still mattered, where the humans didn't push so close." He shrugged. "I didn't go with them." "Why not?" He rubbed the back of his neck, fur shifting along his spine. I didn't want to disappear into silence again. He stood, then paused, looked down at her with something caught between apology and reverence. I don't want to make that mistake again. Evelyn rose, slow, her knees stiff but her voice clear. Then don't. He looked surprised. Promise me, she said. If you ever have to leave, don't vanish. Don't just fade like a shadow. Say goodbye. I can survive a goodbye. I can't survive another silence. He swallowed. I promise. They stood there, two old souls bruised by time, holding truths that had waited too long to breathe. Later that day, Evelyn found herself in the attic, digging through a box she hadn't touched in years. Dust curled in the sunlight as she lifted out a photo. Her sister on the swing, both feet off the ground, mouth open in a laugh so wide it looked like the sky was inside her. She stared at it for a long time, then tucked the handkerchief next to it in a cedar box and locked it shut. Downstairs, Lucy was pacing the porch with a notebook in one hand and a pencil stuck behind her ear. "Did he say anything?" she asked as Evelyn returned. "Yes," Evelyn said simply. "But not all things are mine to repeat." Lucy nodded, then looked past her, toward the woods. "You ever think the trees remember more than we do? I think they forget slower. That evening, Thatcher didn't come, nor the next. The forest stayed silent, but not the way it once had. Not like it was ignoring her. More like it was letting her rest. On the third morning, she woke to birdsong. The real kind. Not a warning. Just life going on. Daniel called that afternoon. Voice lighter than before. Said he might bring Lucy back for Thanksgiving if she wasn't too worn out. Evelyn said she'd set an extra plate. She didn't mention that she'd already set one more. That night, she stepped out onto the porch, a mug in her hands, steam curling into the amber dusk. She sat in Harold's old chair, the one Thatcher always avoided, and let her thoughts wander beyond the trees. Somewhere deep in the woods, something stirred. Not footsteps, not breathing, just presence. She didn't flinch, didn't speak, but she whispered one thing into the air, just in case someone or something was listening. "You're forgiven." The wind shifted, and though nothing moved, the silence felt lighter. Snow had begun to settle in fine white threads across the roof and porch railings, quiet as ash from a long-forgotten fire. The world around Evelyn's cabin was wrapped in that kind of December stillness that made sound feel intrusive, as though even the trees had lowered their voices for winter. Inside, the lights were warm, golden, reflecting off the window panes like melted candle wax. The kitchen smelled of thyme and roasted root vegetables, cinnamon and butter crust. Lucy stood on a stool, tying the last of the cloth napkins into loops while Daniel carved slices off the turkey, glancing once in a while at the back door like it might breathe. Evelyn stirred gravy in a pan she hadn't used since Harold's last Thanksgiving. Her hands were steady, but her mind was louder than the room. The knot in her chest wasn't just anxiety. It was anticipation pressed hard into her ribs. She didn't know what part of the night scared her more. Him showing up, or him not showing up. Joey was setting the table. 7 places. 1 extra fork. 1 chair nobody had questioned. Evelyn had told them it was for Frank. Frank wasn't coming. At 6:03, the first knock hit the back door like a bass drum. Not angry, just massive. Every fork on the table jumped. The glass in the cabinet gave a tiny shudder. Daniel froze, one hand still holding the knife. Lucy turned slowly, mouth parting. Joey looked up from the dinner rolls like he'd just remembered something important from a dream. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She wiped her hands, walked to the door, unlocked it, and opened. He stood there as promised. Thatcher, covered in snow and shadow, one arm cradling something wrapped in oilcloth. Maybe a gift, maybe just something to hold. He ducked slightly, his breath fogging into the cabin light. "I brought something," he said. Nobody moved. The silence inside was thick. Even the radio had clicked off minutes before, like it too had known this moment needed no accompaniment. Evelyn stepped aside. He entered, Had to twist sideways again to make it through. This time, no apologies. Just careful navigation. And when he stood upright in the kitchen, he took up the space like a grand piano in a child's room. Impossible to ignore. Somehow both elegant and wildly out of place. Joey whispered, "Holy crap." Lucy smiled like she'd been waiting her whole life for this exact type of chaos. Daniel was stone. Thatcher looked around and then down at the bundle in his arms. "I made a pie," he said. Evelyn blinked. "You baked?" "I watched a crow do it once. I followed most of the steps." He handed it to her. It smelled like burnt cedar and something vaguely edible. She took it. "Thank you." He looked around the room, then back at the table. "Is this formal?" "It's dinner," Evelyn said. He approached the table with careful steps, sat down on the floor instead of trying a chair, crossed his legs like a storybook giant and folded his hands. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Evelyn sat. Lucy followed. Joey next. Daniel remained standing. His voice was quiet. "You're not Frank." Thatcher raised a brow. "Not unless Frank has a severe hair condition and lives under moss." Joey laughed. Daniel didn't. "You're the thing," Daniel said, staring straight at Evelyn. "The one from the woods, from the prints, from the porch, from everything you never told me." "Yes," Evelyn said. He looked at her like she'd become someone else. Thatcher tilted his head. "You can sit, or you can leave, but you're making the mashed potatoes uncomfortable." Against his better judgment, Daniel sat. Evelyn passed the rolls. Joey took two. Whispered, "Are you real?" "I'd like to think so," Thatcher replied. "But who's to say this isn't all just a dream and you're the one with fur?" Lucy grinned. "Can I ask you questions?" "Only if I can ask some back." She nodded like she'd just been knighted. The meal began. Strangely, it flowed. Thatcher ate with surprising grace, using 2 fingers like tongs, his voice filling the silences between bites with strange observations. Why squirrels bury fake acorns to confuse others. How snow sounds different depending on the kind of leaf it falls on. Which parts of a pine cone are edible in desperation. Joey was enraptured. Lucy was practically glowing. Even Daniel's scowl began to falter. Just a hair. Then Thatcher looked at Lucy. "You think too loudly," he said. She blinked. "I do." He nodded. "I hear it. The wondering, the ache, the questions that don't get answered at school." Lucy's voice dropped. "Like what?" "Like why your mom's always tired when you need her to be loud. Like why people leave. Like whether anything you do matters in the long run." Daniel set his fork down. "That's enough." Thatcher turned toward him, eyes steady. "Truth isn't an attack. It's just heavy." Evelyn spoke gently. "He doesn't mean harm." Daniel stood. "No, of course not. He just shows up, eats our food, and reads our thoughts like it's a goddamn parlor game." "I didn't read," Thatcher said, voice quiet. "I listened." "To what?" "To the parts you try to bury." Daniel stared. Thatcher didn't blink. "I wasn't built for silence," he said. "Not the kind that happens in people, not the kind that echoes." Lucy whispered, "He's not wrong." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Daniel sat again, slower this time. The fire crackled. The wind tapped at the window. Thatcher looked around the table, pausing at each face like he was collecting something invisible. A mood, a memory, a thread. When he stopped on Evelyn, he said nothing. She understood. This night wasn't going to repeat. He cleared his throat and glanced toward the wall where the family photos hung. Young Evelyn, Harold, a little girl with 2 pigtails, a swing. He stood slowly, the room dipping in temperature as he rose. "There are things coming," he said. "Not bad, not good, just different. My clan, my people, they're restless." Evelyn stood with him. "What does that mean?" "They're waking up," he said. "Deciding what matters, who matters, what should be left behind." She touched his arm. "And you?" "I don't know yet." Lucy's voice was barely a whisper. "Are you leaving?" "Not tonight." Joey looked up. "You're coming back, right?" Thatcher smiled. "If you keep setting that extra chair, maybe I'll have the courage to sit in it someday." He bent his head toward Evelyn, deep, respectful, a bow more ancient than language. Then, with the snow catching on his shoulders and the warmth still glowing behind him, he walked out the door, pie plate in hand, and vanished into the trees. No one spoke for a long time. Lucy sat with her chin in her hands, a strange light in her eyes. Joey finally broke the silence. "I like him," Evelyn smiled. "Me too." Daniel didn't answer. But when he helped gather the dishes, his hands were steadier than they'd been in years. Outside, the snow thickened, and in the farthest corner of the woods, something old turned its face toward the light and waited. The snow had melted slow that year, not in drifts or sudden floods, but in thin, retreating bands, like it knew the land it was leaving was about to change. Mud swallowed the edges of Evelyn's path where grass once grew. The pines dripped long after the sky had dried, and the air, though warmer, held an edge. Like a blade dulled, not broken, she noticed the quiet first. It started as an absence. No heavy steps outside the cabin, no gentle scuffle against the porch railing, no low muttering about squirrel conspiracies or full moons meaning mischief. For 3 days, the forest had held its breath. She didn't sleep. She told herself it was nothing, that he was busy, that the woods were wide, that even ancient creatures could have errands. But still, when the wind shifted, she leaned toward it. When the floor creaked in the night, she sat up too fast. When the kettle whistled, she half expected it to be interrupted by a knock. On the 4th morning he returned, not with thunder, not with ceremony, just a low rustle beyond the birch line. And then there he was, taller than she remembered, somehow older. His fur had faded at the temples, streaked in silver where once it was bronze dark. His gait had slowed. He stood still longer between steps, but his eyes were the same. Evelyn stepped onto the porch without her coat. The chill bit her, but she didn't flinch. "I thought," she began. "I know," he said. She waited, but he didn't offer more. So she made tea. He sat on the porch floor again, one arm curled loosely over his knee, his frame drawn in tighter than usual. She noticed how he shifted more, how he rubbed his wrist when he thought she wasn't looking. "Is it the cold?" she asked. "No," he said. "It's time." She looked at him. He didn't look back. "The clan has decided. Too many roads, too many trucks, too many eyes in places that used to belong to silence." He reached into the pouch he always carried and pulled out a torn topographic map. It had red lines sketched across it, hand-drawn in charcoal, notations in symbols she didn't understand. "They want to move north, deeper, past the ridge, somewhere they won't be found. And you," he sighed, "they want me to come. That's not what I asked." His voice was quieter this time. "I don't want to leave." They didn't speak for a while after that. Birds moved through the upper branches. Far off, something broke through a thin crust of frost with a crack like bone. Evelyn sipped her tea. Her hands shook just slightly, not from age. "I spent most of my life afraid of people leaving," she said softly. "My father, my sister, my husband. Always someone stepping out of frame." He said nothing. "But what I feared most," she went on, "was not the leaving. It was the vanishing. No warning, just gone." She looked at him. "I need you to say it." His brow furrowed. She didn't blink. "Say it now, not later, not in the wind. Say goodbye when it's time, not like the others." He nodded slowly. "I will." Later that afternoon, Lucy arrived. She parked at the bottom of the drive, carrying a box of books from college and a bag of groceries Evelyn hadn't asked for. Her coat was too thin for the season, but her eyes were sharp, her voice warmer. "I saw him," she said, before she even crossed the threshold. Evelyn nodded. "He looks tired." "So do you," Evelyn said. Lucy smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. They spent the afternoon sorting books and boiling soup. The radio played a station too soft to name. When Evelyn reached for a can on the highest shelf, her hand faltered. Lucy caught it without comment. "Are you sleeping okay?" she asked. "Not much." You feel sick? No. You scared? Evelyn didn't answer. That night she sat by the fire with a blanket draped across her lap. Lucy sat on the floor, knees tucked to her chest, the room flickering in and out of gold and shadow. Do you remember the time I ran off during the county fair? Lucy asked. Evelyn laughed softly. You made it 2 blocks. I was looking for the tent with the baby goats. I know. You left a trail of cotton candy all the way down Maine. They sat in that memory for a bit, letting it stretch. Then Lucy's voice shifted. I think he saved me once. Evelyn looked over. I must have been 5, Lucy said. We were hiking with Dad. He turned around to take a picture of some lichen, and I wandered off. I remember slipping down a slope, hitting my knee. I screamed, but it wasn't loud. Her voice grew thinner. And then, someone lifted me. Not Dad. Someone huge. I didn't see his face, just warm fur, arms like tree trunks. He put me down on the path right before Dad saw me. She glanced up. It was him, wasn't it? Evelyn nodded. Lucy exhaled. I knew it. Silence folded over them again, this time gentler. Evelyn reached for the blanket. Her fingers hesitated. Her breath caught. Lucy noticed. Are you hurting? Evelyn didn't lie. A little. They didn't talk more that night. The fire burned low, and Evelyn didn't dream. The next morning, Thatcher came early. He stood just beyond the edge of the porch, as if unsure whether to cross. Lucy met him outside. She didn't speak, just walked to him, hands in her coat pockets, and looked up. He looked down. Neither smiled. I remember you, he said. I remember your arms, she replied. He blinked. Lucy reached out and took his hand. It dwarfed hers, but she didn't pull away. You made me feel safe before I knew what safety meant. He nodded. His shoulders eased. They walked together through the edge of the woods. Just a few minutes. Just enough. Back at the cabin, Evelyn sat with a pen in her old, creaky notebook. The one with garden lists, old receipts, and forgotten recipes. She wrote a line at the top of the page, paused, then closed the book again. Too late for lists now. That evening, Thatcher stood at the porch again. Evelyn opened the door. No words. He knelt. She touched his face. I'm glad I met you, she said. His voice cracked. I'm glad you listened. He straightened, then said it. The word. I'll say goodbye when it's time. She nodded. I believe you. He placed a carved object in her hands. Small, wooden, a figure of 2 seated forms side by side. One tall, one small. No faces, just shapes. She held it close. Then he turned and vanished into the trees. But the silence he left behind didn't feel like absence. It felt like a breath drawn deep, waiting. That night, Lucy stood outside, alone. She looked into the dark, into the place where the world folded into itself, and whispered, Thank you. No one answered, but something heard, something always had. The sun was lower than usual that evening, though no one had mentioned it. Not outright. It just hung differently, like it knew the hour mattered more than the day. Long streaks of warm gold slipped through the trees, reaching across the porch like soft fingers trying to hold on to something before it went. They all stood there in a crooked line, barely breathing. Evelyn in the center, wrapped in her thick green shawl. Lucy beside her with her arms crossed tight to her chest. Daniel leaning on the porch beam as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Joey was barefoot, still in pajamas, and didn't seem to care. The air buzzed like a struck tuning fork. And then it shifted. The woods darkened, not because the light vanished, but because something tall had stepped between it and the porch. His silhouette stretched across all of them. One wide shadow. One long goodbye. Thatcher walked slowly, not out of caution, but out of reverence. Every step down the path was deliberate. The forest behind him breathed heavy, as though it too was watching. When he reached the porch steps, he stopped. No one spoke. His gaze scanned each of them. Lucy looked up first. Her eyes were already wet. Daniel's jaw was tight, but his hands didn't shake. He'd spent the last few days fixing the hinges on the back gate, not because it needed it, but because idle hands betray loud hearts. He looked older than usual tonight, like something had finally settled in. Evelyn met Thatcher's eyes and nodded once. Not as invitation, as acknowledgement. He stepped up. The boards creaked under his weight, but the sound wasn't jarring. It was like the house had been waiting to hold it one last time. Without words, he reached out and placed one large hand gently on Evelyn's shoulder. "I'm leaving," he said. And that was it. He didn't try to explain, didn't paint it as necessity. He didn't give them a reason dressed in mystery. He said the truth plainly, like he owed them the decency of clarity. And Evelyn's chin lifted, not in pride, but in trust, because he had kept his promise. He hadn't vanished. He had come back to say it. There was a pause where nobody quite knew how to fill the space, until Joey blurted, "Wait, are you seriously not Frank?" Silence cracked. Thatcher turned slowly, dramatic as a stage actor in a school play, and dropped to one knee in front of the boy. "Joey," he said solemnly, "I have hidden this secret for too long, but now the time has come." Joey's eyes went wide. Thatcher leaned in close. "I am not your Uncle Frank in a gorilla suit." Lucy choked on a laugh. Evelyn covered her mouth with one hand, trying not to smile. Daniel looked away, shaking his head with a tiny grin he didn't bother hiding. "Dang it," Joey muttered. But he was smiling too. The ice was broken, but the weight still hung. Then Thatcher reached into the worn satchel at his side and pulled out a small wooden carving, about the size of a coffee mug. It was a book. Not just any book. Its spine was carved with intricate detail, like one that had been well read, well loved. Its pages were left unmarked, smooth, blank, waiting. He placed it in Evelyn's hands. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me words, for helping me know what to say when it mattered." Evelyn's fingers traced the grain along the spine. Her throat clenched too tight to answer. Then he stood again and looked at Lucy. "You will tell it," he said. "You already know how." Lucy blinked. "Tell what?" He tapped her forehead gently with one finger. "What happened here? What this place remembers? What kindness sounds like when it finally echoes back?" She nodded, not because she understood everything, but because she felt enough to trust it. He stepped down from the porch, walked across the clearing, and just before the tree line swallowed him whole, he turned back. One final glance. He didn't wave, didn't speak, but he smiled. Then, with a deep breath and a slow blink, he stepped into the forest and disappeared. Not vanished, just returned. The family stood in silence for several long moments after. No one rushed to go inside. The golden light had begun to thin, and the air held that quiet buzz that happens just before full dark, when the world pauses between what was and what will be. Joey reached up and took Evelyn's hand. Lucy wiped her cheek, laughing softly at herself. Daniel put an arm around his mother's shoulders. Inside, the fireplace was still warm. They ate late that night. Not a feast, just soup and cornbread, the kind Evelyn had always made too much of. Nobody spoke of him directly, but his presence lingered in the pauses between stories, in the way the candlelight curved around the edges of the table, in the way everyone sat just a little closer than usual. 3 months later, Evelyn passed in her sleep. She hadn't been ill, just tired. Her body had softened like dusk, slow and silent, the way the tide leaves the shore at midnight. Lucy found her the next morning, still wearing her sweater, the wooden book figure clutched loosely in her hand. Her mouth was slightly parted, like she'd been mid-laugh or just about to answer something. The funeral was small. No announcements, just close ones. Daniel, Lucy, Joey, and a few neighbors who remembered the librarian who had once read aloud every Tuesday at the library, even when no one came. Lucy stayed a few extra days. She walked the woods alone, retraced every path, every branch. The house felt strange without Evelyn's voice, but not empty, because the silence didn't feel cold anymore. It felt aware. She packed lightly when she left. just the carved book figure and Evelyn's green shawl. Years passed, but the story didn't fade, because Lucy told it. Not with microphones or documentaries or polished scripts. She told it the way her grandmother had taught her. In kitchens, on porches, around fire pits. In small rooms with older folks who still believed that magic was real and kindness could grow wild in the woods if you let it. She told it with pauses, with breath, with silence where silence belonged. And whenever someone asked, "But did he really exist?" she'd smile and shrug. "Does it matter?" she'd say. And sometimes, late at night, after a story had ended and the candles were low and someone had fallen asleep in their chair, she'd feel it. That hum, that presence, that low thrum in the bones of the trees. And she'd know. Something out there still listened, still watched, still remembered. And if you were quiet enough, if you were still enough, if you sat alone on a porch at sunset with a cup of something warm and your heart cracked open just a little, you might just hear him, grumbling about squirrels, asking for tea, or whispering a goodbye, one that was never really final. Some stories don't end with thunder or applause. They end the way real life often does, softly, in the hush between two seasons, with a breath held just long enough to remind us we were here, that someone saw us, that something mattered. There's a truth that echoes beneath every tall tree, beneath every quiet gesture we think no one notices. The world is always listening. And sometimes, the gentlest forces in our lives are the ones that leave the deepest marks, not with noise, but with presence, with patience, with love shown in ways that don't need words. At the heart of this story is something we all search for: connection, not just with others, but with the parts of ourselves we've buried out of fear or time or hurt. There is healing in being seen. And there is a special kind of grace in finally understanding that forgiveness, whether of others or of ourselves, isn't something we wait to earn. It's something we choose to give. Freely, quietly, completely. Sometimes what saves us isn't a miracle or a grand gesture. It's the steady rhythm of another heartbeat near ours. A presence that doesn't need to explain itself. Something ancient. Something kind. Something that refuses to walk away when everything else has. In a world so often built on noise and division, there's a quiet revolution in simply choosing to stay, to listen, to remember, and to pass on what we've learned. Not through preaching, but through stories, through silence filled with meaning, through the act of holding space for another living soul. Maybe that's all legacy ever really is. Not what we built or owned or proved, but who we sat beside in the dark, who we made feel less alone. So if this story stayed with you, even for a moment, carry it. Not because it's perfect, but because it's real. Because it reminds us that even the things we don't understand, especially those things, can be sacred. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for listening. If this story moved you, we'd love to know. Leave a comment. Tell us what it stirred in you or what it reminded you of. Your words mean more than you know. And if you haven't already, don't forget to follow or subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story we whisper into the world. Until then, stay kind, stay curious, and keep the light on for whatever finds you in the dark.